Now, whenever we're signed in with Google, we're getting our user information with the help of our me query. But we're not storing it anywhere in our app. We'll need to access it later, for example, to display the user's name, to use the user's information throughout our app. So right now we're going to get started setting up our state management system. This is going to primarily consist of two hooks, the useReducer and useContext hooks. So we'll get started by going to index.js within source to set this up, and we'll begin by, after the React import, adding a comma and grabbing both useContext and useReducer. How is our state management system going to work? Well, first we're going to create some context, and this will basically function as the initial state of our application, and that's going to live in a file which we'll call context.js within source. So we'll make sure that this is within source, and we'll add context.js, where up at the top we'll import create context, and this will come from React. And in order to store our user data, we'll execute create context and then add a property on it, current user set initially to null, which we'll update. We'll add some additional properties on context for other pieces of our application, but for now we'll just create it and put it in a variable called context. You could call this app context, for example. I'm just keeping it general. And then we'll export default context at the bottom. Then back within index.js, we will import context from /context. Then we can hook into the context that we created with useContext. We pass in the entire context object, both the provider and consumer properties on context, and then we get back a value which we'll call our initial state. Then in order to modify our context, in order to make changes to pieces of it, for example, the current user property, we can create a reducer. Once again within source, we'll add a reducer.js file, and up at the top we'll export default a function which we'll call reducer, and the reducer, when it's executed, will get access to two values, the entire state object as well as the action that's taking place. So according to what action takes place within our application, we're going to set up a switch statement according to the type of the action, which will be available on action.type. And if action.type has a string value of login_user, which is the action that will fire off when a user logs in, we're going to return an object where we spread in all of the other state values that we might have and just update the current user. And we're going to set that equal to action.payload. So for every action that's executed or dispatched, we're going to send over two types of information: the type of action that took place, which is just going to be a string, and then the payload, which is the data that we're sending over itself. And here we're setting that equal to current user. So we're updating the current user value from null. We'll set up a default case where if none of the action types match in this switch statement, we'll just return state unchanged. And so to use this reducer that we're exporting, we'll go back to index.js, we'll import reducer from /reducer, and now we can use the useReducer hook right after useContext, and useReducer is going to take our reducer function as well as the initial state that we're getting from useContext. So useReducer provides to the reducer function the state that we receive here in the first parameter, and from useReducer we get back two values within a set of brackets, and these declared variables will be state and dispatch. State will be our app state after the reducer has run and processed our initial state, and dispatch will make it possible to dispatch actions. Then to provide state and dispatch to our different components to read and update state, we will use the context that we're importing to create a provider from context.provider, and we'll wrap it around our switch statement. Then to pass state and dispatch down, we'll put them on the value prop as an object, so we'll add another set of curly braces here. We'll include state and dispatch. And then in order to use this object, to receive this object from any component, we can go into that component, and in our case that will be login, and then import context, the context object from .. context. And from login we want to dispatch an action to update our global state with our current user. So we will, in order to read from context, bring in useContext from React here as well, add useContext to the top of our component, pass in the context object, and from it we can destructure dispatch to dispatch our action. Then within onSuccess, when we get back our user data from the me query, we can dispatch like so, passing in our type as login user and our payload as data.me. Once we do that, our state is going to be updated. And we can confirm that this worked by heading to index.js and simply console logging state. So let's save all of these files, and if I set up everything correctly, there shouldn't be any errors. And we might have been logged in automatically. You can see initially current user set to null, and then current user includes the result of our me query. So this is how we're going to manage state within our application. And in the next section, we'll work on finishing up our login component, our splash page, so we can move on to working on the app itself.